Part 4. How did the British try to resolve the conflicts of the Arab and Jews after the Balfour Declaration?
Since the Jews last exiled by the Romans, the land was never safe for their return. The majority of Jews were denied by every colonizing empire the right of return without the risk to their life, restricted freedoms, give up their beliefs and convert to Christianity or then later Islam, extra financial conditions, or required to join an army to kill more of their own kin, all simply for being Jewish. Many Jews did make the return back to the land of their ancestors, but did so under the judgment of what they deemed as the lesser of two evils, whether remaining where they are being persecuted for being Jewish, or returning and facing a different type of persecution. Now the Ottoman Caliphate was defeated, and the British colonizers who occupied the land decreed the land to change back to being a Jewish state. It may seem like it was now safe for Jews to return. The British, with the support of the UN, were meant to help Jewish refugees with safe passage to return and help oversee that no one was met with prejudice who was coming to or already existed in the land, Jews, Muslims, or anyone else. Helping to peacefully formulate the land to a position where it can be legally handed over as a Jewish state to a national governing body. The British did begin this, in the sense of helping Jewish refugees come back to the land which they were indigenous to, but in limited numbers in order to not upset the balance of the land. However, when the refugees arrived, the Arab Muslims who refused it to become a Jewish state met them on the beaches with violence, throwing stones at the Jews and battling with the British to push the Jews back into the sea. This is the first instance of where the phrase "from the river to the sea" emerged, meaning to keep the majority of the land Jewish free and denying the right of a Jewish state. The British helped most of the Jews to get through the violence and allowed the pathway for the Jews to find unoccupied lands within the British Mandatory Palestine, to build new homes. The first groups of returning Jews, after making it through the violence they were greeted with, began building new communities more inland, relatively unchallenged by the Arabs. This was because the lands they found passage to, away from the bombardment of violence and prejudice, were deemed by the Arabs as uninhabitable, and the Arabs didn't think they would survive. As previously stated in earlier parts of this series, large parts of lands which weren't desert were covered in marshes filled with malaria. So many laughed at them for thinking they could finally be safe in their promised land and live happily in these areas. To these people's surprise, the Jews used innovation and realized by planting eucalyptus plants in the marshes, it would naturally drain the marshes and rid the land of malaria. The Jews did this and successfully built sustainable communities. As the first returning Jewish communities were growing, more limited numbers of Jewish refugees were arriving to the land. This angered the Arabs who refused the decree by the British for the land to become a Jewish state, and the Arabs began a series of constant assaults on Jewish communities, killing a number of them. The British acted as a police force to help protect the Jews from being attacked, but often failed in completely protecting them. This was also due to the fact that what many miss to mention is the populations of Arabs in the land also increased at this time. As the Jews converted what the Arabs believed to be uninhabitable lands, many, including the British, realized there is opportunity for further development which created more job opportunities. As such, thousands of Arabs from surrounding regions looking for potentially richer, better, and safer lives flooded to the land to take advantage of the Jewish developments. This only helped to grow the Arab numbers and subsequent assaults against the Jews. The fact is, where the Jewish population certainly grew as a result of the British and UN supported Balfour Declaration, the Jewish population over the next 10 years, from the point the British formally took mandatory control of the region, grew by approximately 90,000 people, whereas the Muslim Arab population in the same period grew by approximately 200,000 people. As time went on, the arriving Jews suffering from forced exile from their adopted homes across Europe and surrounding Arab regions made the Jewish communities in certain areas over time start to become much stronger, regardless of the fact the Arab populations were increasing at a higher rate. The Arabs carried on the attacks, but many Jews now started to respond in kind. Where Arabs killed Jews, the Jews replied back with killing Arabs. The British, seeing the Jews getting stronger, appeared to switch between which side they were supporting at any given moment, which only seemed to encourage the violence rather than de-escalate it. Seeing this, it prompted a rise of a small minority of Jews to become extremists, known today as Zionist extremists. They believed that it was their divine right to the land, and all those who opposed and stood in their way of the Zionist aspirations should leave or be killed. This was not the consensus amongst the Jewish population, only that of an extremely small minority. Seeing the mentalities of these few, the Arabs labelled all the Jews as this and seemed to become paranoid, believing conspiracy theories that the Jews intend to attack all of them. This was never proven and never actually occurred as a united effort, but it didn't stop many Arabs believing this. Whether they made it up to inspire other Arabs to pick up arms against the Jews, or whether it was a natural belief grown out of fear from seeing the small minority of Jewish extremists voicing these things, we can't be certain. Arabs started to further attack Jewish communities, looking to force them to flee to other lands. This was not limited to newly formed Jewish communities, but also to those that had never left the land for centuries, such as in Hebron. Arabs killed nearly 70 Jews in the Jewish Hebron community, and forced the rest of the community to flee for their lives. Whilst the Arabs stole all of the Jews' possessions and demolished their homes, to then rebuild their own Arab homes on top of the ruins. These actions by the Arabs similarly repeated all over the region, such as the north coastal areas and south in the Gaza area. The Zionist extremists blamed the British for allowing these events to occur and not controlling the attacks, and therefore conspired together and bombed a British hotel which housed many British officials. This didn't help anything, and only allowed further escalations of violence, which resulted in many mini-civil wars between Arab and Jewish communities. Every time an Arab killed Jews, Jews retaliated in killing a similar number of Arabs. And separate to this, both Arab extremists and Zionist extremists blamed the British and attacked their forces at times. A point often ignored and instead has a stream of false propaganda connected to it by people trying to deny history, is that the only existing communities that were killed or forced to flee and then taken over throughout these conflicts were Jewish. No Arab community was taken over by any Jew, and no land was stolen by a Jew up to and including this period of time. Only unoccupied lands became homes for further Jewish communities, on top of the Jewish communities that had already existed for centuries, and were legally bought from vacant landlords from Egypt and Syria, and lands acquired by the British. The tensions and hatred after the Balfour Declaration between the two sides of Arabs and Jews only grew. Many Arab leaders tried to impose a boycott of all Arabs trading or working with Jews from 1922, which only created further segregations and divisions. The Arabs became more and more united in their efforts to cast out both the British and the Jews, and have the land as an Islamic state. This all gave birth to Palestinian Arab nationalism, whose leader of which was a man called Amin al-Husseini. Al-Husseini was a devout Muslim and fought for the Ottomans against the Allied nations. He then helped to unite the Arabs in Palestine and form the first self-proclaimed Arab all-Palestinian government. It is key to note that at this time, it wasn't a majority consensus of all Arabs in the region referring to themselves as Palestinian. This was still a new concept to them, and the new self-identified label only at this time started to become popular within the Arab rebels. The concept of not just Arabs, but a nation of people called Palestinian only became popularized in the mid-1960s. Al-Husseini, the leader of these rebels, was found guilty by the British of organizing attacks against the Jews and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. But surprisingly, was pardoned a year later by British officials who not only released him, but appointed him Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, believing this would keep him focused on religion, not nationalism, and away from encouraging the revolts. But this was a mistake by the British to think the revolts from the Arabs was actually about land and not religion. Al-Husseini, by now acting as the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, actually put him in a position of power where he encouraged Islam and the rise of anti-Zionism and destruction of any idea of a Jewish state and destruction of the Jewish populations. He then later became in league with the Nazi Germany regime and supported their ideals in their treatment of Jews. Al-Husseini carried on his initiatives of uniting the Arabs of Palestine and opposing not just the Jews but also the British, despite being put in a position of power by the British. As the British discovered his initiatives to incite further violence against the Jews, which resulted in the Arab Revolt in 1936, causing many deaths on both sides. They also discovered his initiatives to incite violence against the British, and so the British issued a warrant for his arrest. Al-Husseini fled to Nazi Italy and Germany. From here, he encouraged the Arab Palestinians to join the Nazi cause, which many of the Palestinian Arabs did. And he also worked with Hitler to encourage the eradication of Jews from everywhere, including Palestine. He helped further by translating all the German anti-Semitism propaganda into Arabic, to encourage the uprise of anti-Semitism across all Arab regions. This resulted in the Arab Palestinians being in support of the Nazis, and so were a number of other Arab regions. This only encouraged more killings of Jews, not just across British Mandatory Palestine, but also surrounding Arab regions and the world, and forced more Jews to flee their homes in these other regions, which, despite the Arabs wanting less Jews in Palestine, actually caused more Jews to arrive, as many had nowhere else to go. After Al-Husseini fled to Nazi Italy and Germany, the British ordered an investigation into the reasons for the constant unrest in British Mandatory Palestine. It was deemed that the UN decree of the whole area becoming a Jewish state was now unworkable, and so proposed a two-state solution, which gave a minority share of the land to the Jewish regime and the majority to the Arabs as an Islamic regime. The Arabs unanimously refused this, demanding for all the area to be an Islamic state. But in an attempt to appease to the UN, they stated they will protect the rights of legitimate existing Jews under an Islamic state, but also demanded a ban on any more Jewish refugees being allowed entry, and no existing Jew in the land was allowed to purchase any more land, unoccupied or occupied. The Zionist Committee of Jews was split, with half of them wanting to accept the two-state solution, despite only being given a minority of the land to be recognized as a Jewish state, equating to less than 30% of the whole of British Mandatory Palestine, and the other half of the Zionists being undecided. Many of this undecided side didn't strictly oppose the idea of a two-state solution, more the borders that were presented on offer, especially as these borders were the furthest points away from the holiest sites in Jerusalem and Hebron. This initial two-state solution with these proposed borders was called the Peel Commission. The Zionists sent an offer to convene a council of all sides while this proposal was on the table, to also propose an alternative to discuss the possibility of a peaceful solution of an undivided Palestine, respecting both sides and all beliefs. Some believed there were alternative motives behind this, believing the Jews planned to look to increase their numbers to eventually be the majority and subsequently turn the state into a Jewish state over time anyway. This theory didn't matter, as the Arabs refused the Peel Commission outright and refused to counsel with the Jews. And, instead of the Arabs responding with alternative diplomatic suggestions and negotiations, they decided to carry on their physical assaults, revolts, and boycotts against the Jews, which helped to make the first recognized Arab-Jew civil war last 3 years. With no sign of the Peel Commission proposal even having meetings between the two sides to discuss, and the Arabs flatly refusing and continuing their assaults, the British scrapped the idea, and their focus after was more towards the rise of World War II. So, many of the Arab Palestinians voluntarily joined the Nazi regime. How did the Jews respond? Not all, but the majority of the fighting Palestinian Arabs did join the Nazi regime, and the now all-Arab Palestinian government leader al-Husseini had a big hand in the Nazi regime's final solution plans towards the Jews. As the Jews were getting ethnically cleansed from surrounding Arab regions and from Europe, more looked for a place of refuge. With the known rise of Zionism, many believed it would be safest to return to the land of their indigenous roots, joining the existing growing Jewish communities in an area the British originally decreed to become a Jewish state. But with the rise of anti-Zionism and violence between the Arabs and Jews, the British, in an attempt to avoid further escalations, banned Jewish immigration. This wasn't taken well by the Jewish population already in British Mandatory Palestine, nor by those who were fleeing for their life, unsure of where they can go. As a result, the Jews looked to support their people fleeing from the atrocities of the Nazis and those that supported the Nazis in Europe, North Africa Arab regions, and surrounding Arab regions, by implementing many operations to bring many of the Jews to British Mandatory Palestine for safety, while avoiding the British patrols. This only increased the frustrations of the Arabs, who were now associated to the Nazi regime, with desire to rid the land of Jews, and also angered the British as it served to give more unbalance to the status quo of the land. The Jews were being slaughtered in mass by the Nazi regime and had nowhere to go. Many sought refuge in lands further to the west, and many did not have this opportunity, needing to flee without being noticed by the Nazi regime. The Zionists offered support where most other countries at the time did not provide any conclusive solutions. The act by the British to try and prevent further unbalance in British Mandatory Palestine is understandable, but served to not help the Jews or prevent them from being slaughtered, all while the leader of the many violent efforts against the Jews by the Palestinian Arabs was supporting Hitler in promoting his aspirations to rid the world of the Jews, even at one point looking to exile all global Jews to Madagascar. But this idea ended and the Nazis reverted to putting Jews into concentration camps. This point here is, yes, more Jews at this time coming to Palestine disrupts the status quo and adds more pressure to the division and conflict. But one, it was already decreed by the British and supported by the UN to become a Jewish state, and it was their job to help make that happen, not prevent it. And two, where else were the Jews to go at the time, where they could feel safe amongst their own people, with more or less no countries offering any support to them trying to escape? There is a definite argument to state that Jews in British Mandatory Palestine shouldn't have encouraged further Jews returning to their ancestors' land, but this argument needs to be in balance with the fact the fighting Palestinian Arabs assisted in causing more Jews in regions outside of Palestine being forced to leave their homes without anywhere to go. In the end, 6 million Jews were murdered in the Nazi regime under the Nazis' final solution of the Jews, which al-Husseini assisted with, and to this day only 16 million are left. To put it into perspective, this equates to about 5% of the Muslim population in just the Arab states, and 1% of the global Muslim population. Around 40% of all Jews globally were slaughtered by the Nazis. So, the land was already decreed to be a Jewish state, and a common misconception is that of people thinking some of the land was then given to the Jews as people felt sorry for them after World War II. Well, after the Nazi regime was defeated in World War II, there still lay the problem of British Mandatory Palestine, a problem which has only increased in conflict and with populations now increasing at a higher rate for the Jews to the land from surrounding Arab regions in Europe in comparison to the Arabs from surrounding Arab regions. To give approximate figures, the Jewish population from the start of the Nazi regime in the 1930s until its end in the 1940s grew by around 450,000. However, the Arab Muslim populations grew by around 400,000 across the same period. The UN did not think it was viable to continue in any way with the one Jewish state solution, given the struggles in the land. As such, the UN went back to the idea of a two-state solution, but with acknowledgements to the heavily increased Jewish refugee populations. They knew the previous proposal of 30% of the land being Jewish wasn't enough to accommodate, so they decreed an even split of the land to be close to around 50-50, with Jerusalem remaining an international territory, half being a Jewish state and half being an Islamic state. What is key to note on this, which the maps do not show you, is a large amount of the land decreed to be Jewish in this split is uninhabitable desert in the south, and even with the Jewish innovations to make certain areas habitable, they hadn't worked out how to make sustainable communities in these desert regions as of yet. The split was actually a lot more in favour to the Palestinian Arabs in regard to fertile lands. The actions done by the Nazis against the Jews naturally had an effect on this decision being made, but not in the way of people just feeling sorry for the Jews so thought to give them a place to call their own. Instead, the actions of the Nazis highlighted the already present issues. It highlighted that nowhere in the world is there a Jewish state. There's a large number of Muslim and Christian states, but no Jewish. And while they do not have a state which matches their cultures and customs, they will always be seen by many as the others. The Nazi regime also highlighted the issue of how much anti-Semitism there is in the world, and that not many countries actually supported the Jews in escaping the Nazis. It also highlighted the issue in the Middle East, whereby many Arab regions forced thousands of Jews to leave their areas at the same time, and so put in clear doubt that the majority of Muslim Arabs would ever accept and coexist within a Jewish state. The UN enforced the two-state solution of 50-50 in 1947, giving the Arabs in Palestine their first ever sovereign state of Palestine, and allowing the Jews to also once again have a Jewish state in the area from which they derive from. The Arab regimes, not just the Palestinian, but also across the surrounding regions, refused this once again, demanding all the land to be an Islamic state, whereas the Jews accepted the decree without further demands. Despite this split meant they had to give up rights to their holy sites, and their holiest in Jerusalem would be under international control and not theirs. It was decreed that in 1948 the State of Israel and the State of Palestine would be formally recognized and powers from Britain would be handed over. In the weeks leading up to the formal implementation of the two states, the Israeli government issued a plea to all Arab Muslims who would fall under the border to be classed as Israel to remain in the land, and to help the country to prosper with a coexisting peaceful community, and together make it a success. All would be granted immediate citizenship and equal rights. The reason for the plea was because Israel wanted to highlight their position, wanting a land that was prophesied in their beliefs, whereby it would be a Jewish state but coexisting equally and peacefully with those of non-Jewish beliefs. Also, they released the plea because they were aware of the growing unrest and intentions of the Arabs, and could see the hundreds of thousands who had started to voluntarily flee the land because some didn't want to live in a Jewish state, and others who fled because they expected a war to come and didn't want to be caught in the crossfire. Israel's plea was also to try and prevent any war from happening, as they themselves knew it was becoming increasingly likely. So much so, in anticipation, Israel bought weapons from Czechoslovakia in case of war for months leading up to the day of being formally recognized. Where the Arabs in Palestine had support from all surrounding Arab Muslim nations to gear up to declaring war, Israel only had the support from Czechoslovakia, and only in the form of being able to buy weapons from them in case of an assault being made against them.